Welcome to Ed Talks. My name is Janay Nugent. I am a Board of Governors teaching chair here at the University of Lethbridge. I would like to start by recognizing that our university rests on traditional Blackfoot lands, and our traditional Blackfoot greeting would be Oki Nitsu Kawawa. Welcome to our friends and our relatives. So today we have the great pleasure of speaking to Dr. Ann Dymond, who is the incoming Board of Governors teaching chair. So we get to work together for the next year, which I'm quite excited about. But I'd like to start by asking you maybe to tell us a little bit about your teaching journey, just so we can get to know you a bit.
Thanks for having me, Janay. I am an art historian, and I came to Lethbridge in 2000, straight out of my PhD. And I came from a program that was really traditional. It was very writing-based, and criticizing other people's arguments was sort of the focus. And the model of teaching I was exposed to at Queen's mostly was really sink or swim, right? Like if you weren't good at something, then you just didn't do well, and the classes were big. And I never spoke to a teacher in my undergrad, ever.
Never, really?
No, never.
Oh my gosh,
yeah,
that's
no,
crazy.
I was, and so when I came here, it was, and the classes were smaller, and the students taught me a lot. And they taught me in some sense that model didn't work well for anyone, not even the students who, like me, were sort of bookish and oriented towards that kind of learning. So over time, I started to realize that we all in the class learned better if there were more kinds of ways of teaching and learning. And then I got involved with the Teaching Center and started to kind of expand my toolkit, I would say, and now try to reach more students than the model I was exposed to. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
Yeah, definitely. Yep. So you sort of started with your the system that you had learned from, and
as we do,
yeah.
Right? I mean, most of us aren't, or when I went through grad school, most of us weren't trained in how to be teachers, and I think most of us at that time went, oh, I really liked this teacher, and for me that was, a teacher who gave really dynamic lectures, but enthusiasm and a good lecture, it's still only, I think it's really important, but it still only takes you so far, right? There are other ways of expanding what we do in the classroom. And so thinking of ways assignments could be more innovative, for example, things that weren't writing, although writing is very important in my discipline, and I think it's an important skill to teach, but realizing, oh, there are ways besides 2 essays that I can teach writing in, that was really important.
Right. Do you want to tell us a little bit about any of the assignments and how they kind of have evolved over time for you?
Well, if I think about writing assignments specifically, the model I came out of was write an essay on Picasso. Literally that would be the instructions, write a 10-page essay on one of these artists, and that was it. And so realizing, okay, actually, our students need a lot more scaffolding, and I certainly could have used a lot more scaffolding when I was a student, and by scaffolding I mean a series of steps that take them to the place that you want to be. So for example, in the 1000 course that we offer, last time I offered it, I started with a blog assignment, right? Like a kind of informal writing that is in language that students understand, and say, okay, tell me what you think about this thing that wasn't too foreign to them, right? That was sort of from pop culture. And then tried to move that into, okay, how is that different from academic writing? Why do academics write the way they do? And until you get the students understanding why academics write the way they do, and it's not just big, difficult words, although that is sometimes a part of it, sometimes problematically a part of it, but getting students to realize, actually, we think of writing as advancing an argument, and so your writing relies on, it's not just your opinion, it enters into a series of arguments that others have made, and you need to present those to the reader and engage with them and disagree with them, or agree with them, use them as support, but there's a whole sort of series of steps to get to why do academics write the way they do, and there's a good reason for it, but until students get to the place where they understand it, they can't do it.
Yeah, and learning how to write a well-argued, well-supported piece is much different than I have this opinion because I have this response to it. So, and that is very different, especially in our society. Everybody's quite has their opinions and, you know.
Yeah, and I mean things that have really wide applicability that I think we teach in the humanities generally about how do you tell what fake news is, right? How do you tell if a source is a good source or not a good source? Those are all things that come through writing assignments, essentially, right? Like when students start to understand it's a process of a way of thinking through a set of arguments, that's really useful. So for me, like almost all my assignments now are broken down into a series of smaller steps that the students get more feedback along the way. Of course, that's harder to do in a bigger class, but still we do our best to do that, right? So.
Yeah, and so you were talking about something that the education lingo would call outcomes-based education, right?
Right.
And that is something that you're quite interested in sort of pursuing in the construction of your assignments, is making sure that you're achieving a certain outcome from the class. And
I think many of us, when we start teaching, if we haven't had training in teaching, we might not realize that we have specific outcomes in mind for specific assignments, but probably close to 10 years ago now, I did with the Teaching Centre a thing called the Instructional Skills Workshop, which I know you've been a part of as well, that really made it clear to me that thinking more concretely, more explicitly about what the outcomes are just makes the assignment clearer. And so one of the things that I've started to realize more and more is that I used to sort of think, students need to write well. I used to sort of think, students need to write well in this course. They need to learn to write well, for example. But I also need to start thinking about how that fits into the overall curriculum for the program. Right? So what writing well means in a 1,000 level course is different than what writing well means in a 3,000 level course. There are some overlapping aspects, but thinking about the really specific outcomes, like in a 1,000 level class, that might mean, and they have to have learned how to use a single peer-reviewed source, right? It means that they needed to engage critically with one source. And by 3,000 level, they might need to have figured out that they need to use multiple sources critically and use competing voices and assess them differently, for example. Right? So that thinking about the outcomes in that kind of specific was really helpful to me.
Like both for this, the individual assignment.
Both for this, the individual assignment and how that of individual assignment fits into the broader curriculum of our department. It maybe also relates to, in my department, we are a combined art studio and art history and museum studies department. So in art history, in general, the students understand that writing well will be an important part of their future careers. In art studio, the students, not all of the majors in art studio who want to be artists, come in understanding that writing will be important to them. And some of our art studio students are our best writers. It's, it varies. But many of them might have, because they're they're better, stronger naturally at the visual, they might not be aware of that they can be decent writers. And more than that, they need to learn to be good writers to pitch their projects, right? So what they will be using their writing for in the future is different, but at some point I realized those outcomes, they need to be clear to the students as well as clear to me, so that the student understands, this outcome has meaning to me, it has a use to me, and this prof cares that this assignment is meaningful to me. Right. That became really important to me. Like, I think earlier, I was stronger at knowing myself what I wanted the outcomes to be, and then realizing, there's one more step, and that's getting the students to recognize the value of the outcome. That was important to me.
Right, and that value of that outcome is critical, right? So, we sit in these classes and we look at art and we critically analyze it and why it's important and what it means and, all the various questions that you might ask about it. And those outcomes, do you want to talk a little bit about what those outcomes mean in the classroom, but also beyond the classroom? So art history, why does it matter?
It might be another big question.
I know, let's jump into that one.
So, I really became an art historian because, for lots of different reasons, but one of the parts that was important to me was to realize how much the visual world is an indicator of how societies think and what they value in the past, right? It's one way of getting an access to an earlier time. But really, to me, the value of your field too, of history as well, is that sense of when you understand this other culture existed and had a coherent set of beliefs and they were fundamentally different from yours, is really valuable. And it makes you realize that so many of the things that we take for granted are actually cultural. They are not biological, they're not natural, and that allows you to think more critically about our own society. And there's a million disciplines that could happen for you. For me, that happened in art history. And that is partly because I had a great prof who made that clear to me, right? So, for example, when we teach ancient Greek history, it seems really remote to us today, but it's such a fundamentally different culture. And I'm not an expert in ancient Greece, but we teach it in our lower level courses. And when you recognize that they had a sexual system that was very different from contemporary sexual practices in the West, it's enlightening, right? And often our students come in and they might come from places that where they haven't been exposed to a diversity of sexual identities or sexual practices. And to have an instructor teaching about a different kind of sexual value, it's really an important moment, right? And you can't teach the history of art without talking about why ancient Greece valued the male nude in the way that it does, right? And it gets at all sorts of questions about power in society and how power is built into all sorts of everyday objects, right?
Right.
And that is really one example of how understanding a different culture's art can make you realize things about your own culture. Right?
Yeah, that's yes, history as well, right? We have those moments and those examples. And we can really remove ourselves from those times and places and look at them objectively because we're not immersed in them. But once you start to see the patterns and you see how they're represented, then all of a sudden you start to see it in our own society and it opens up your eyes to how we're influenced by, say, the visual or whatever it is that we're looking at.
So another example might be like something that might be difficult for us to access in our own lives, but when you deal with a parallel issue historically, is 19th century landscape, right? So when I teach 19th century American landscape painting, it's really about the settlement of the West and the erasure of indigenous people from the landscape, right? Landscape painters at the beginning of American landscape painting often include indigenous figures, and as the settlement moves west, they take them out more and more. And I have found over time that students can talk about that easily when it's American culture, right? And not until sort of later in the term when we've built a more trusting relationship can you kind of flip it into, okay, like how does that relate to the contemporary? How does that relate to where we are situated, right? And it's something that if you started from the contemporary, it would be difficult, but when you get at it through the historical, it's really easier for them to think critically about it.
That raises a question about indigenizing curriculum because that's one of the things that TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, had called for in its calls for action, and that our university is looking at how we might be able to do this and what does that even mean. Is this something that making sure that there's an Indigenous presence and representation and topic and conversation in your classes, has that been important for you since the beginning? Have you been more sort of tuned into it since the TRC, or maybe since you've been here on Blackfoot territory? I mean, where does that interest come from? Because it's not part of 19th century France necessarily.
Yes, so my expertise is in 19th century French art and 19th century art more generally. And so that wasn't part of my training. And my discipline has traditionally been very Eurocentric, right? Very, very Eurocentric. For me, the sort of first awareness of that came through the other side of my discipline, which is museum studies. And museum studies in Canada has been really animated for the last 20 years with issues of indigenizing the institutions, because we came to realize some decades ago, and some of us knew many decades before, that museums were a place that reinforced a kind of idea of European superiority, and they did that by classifying European culture as art and other people's culture as craft, essentially.
Right.
That's a sort of simplification.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, museums are a really important place for that discourse. So I came to my knowledge of Indigenous art really around the museum studies issue and the issue of the importance of inclusion, which is really important to me. And for a long time in my courses, I was still teaching Western art. And it took me a bit longer to get to, okay, I actually can't teach a survey of Western art. If I teach a survey of Western art still, it reinforces an exclusionary mechanism, and that's not good. It's not good for my Blackfoot students. It's not good for my non-Blackfoot students, right? It's not good for any of us. And so a few years ago, we rejigged our curriculum and made our big survey course, like prehistory to 1750, a global survey, which has been really important to me. And last year was the first year I decided, like, small things that can be really important, like I started having, or maybe 2 years ago, I started having on my course syllabi a statement saying we're on Blackfoot territory, as you started this with. And I didn't know if that would be significant to people, but it really was, right? I had students coming up to me and saying, I'm so glad that you did that. So last year, one of the things that I also did was invite Indigenous speakers into both of the classes that I was speaking, or that I was teaching, and that was quite useful too. Both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students said that they found it really meaningful to hear an Indigenous perspective on art history. And there's no question that an Indigenous perspective on the history of art is different than mine, and I can't access all of those things. So having multiple voices in the front of the classroom, I think, is really useful.
Right, yeah, that's great. And I think, were you also involved in your department having Native American art?
Yeah, right. So probably a decade ago now, a group of us got together and realized that we could have a parallel stream for both of our majors. At that time, we had an art history and museum studies major and an art studio major. And by working with the Department of what was then Native American Studies, but it will be Indigenous Studies soon, we could offer students a combined degree, essentially, so that it became degrees in Native American art history and museum studies and Native American art studio.
Oh, cool.
And that was, that it's a small program, but it's been a really important program for our whole department. Once the whole department committed to that, there's an ongoing position, there's a tenure track position in that. That's really important, right? And it's increased our ties to Native American studies, and it's really useful. And more than that, it means that we have more Indigenous students in all of our classes. So that's maybe one part of indigenizing the curriculum. The art history museum studies major, because many of our students would go on to work in museums, and if you want to work in a museum in Canada, you have to understand the basics of Canadian settler history, and you have to understand Indigenous history that predates that settler history and postdates it. So our art history museum studies major has always had required Indigenous courses in the curriculum. So that's been, I think that's a real strength of our program.
So would you say that teaching art history is different from teaching museum studies?
I think it is, or it is the way we do it here, because our art history courses tend to be larger, and our museum studies courses are quite small, and it's more specifically oriented towards teaching skills that will be used, right? So the program, it's a small major, but we have a really good record placing our students so that they have good work experience in their undergrad and they go on to get jobs, which is great. They need the art historical background if they want to work in art galleries, but the museum studies in some ways can stand alone. Like we get lots of history majors taking those courses if you want to work in a more sort of a broader cultural gallery. And that part of the curriculum is set up so that students typically gain really practical skills. I teach the theory side of museum studies, and my colleague Josephine Mills, who's the director of the art gallery, tends to teach more hands-on courses. But even even in that, we've been able to use the Penny Gallery downtown to work with our students. So probably 5 years ago now, I decided that students should get some experience doing things that are outside of official learning, and said, okay, like, I'll supervise you. Go make a show, right? How do you do that, right? And that sense of, in museum studies, maybe more than art history here, because we're so far from historical art as a general rule in Southern Alberta. In museum studies, we have the spaces in town to empower students to learn by doing.
Right.
So we now have a sort of regularized experience where students say, okay, we're going to curate a show of our colleagues, our peers. So I have students every year who curate a student show at the gallery. So they have to come up with a theme, they have to put the call out, they have to tell some of their colleagues that they didn't get into the show, right? Like, there's parts of being a curator that are really challenging for students, right? So that, it's not a traditional learning model, it's a much more active learning model. And often what I'm doing is coaching from the sidelines rather than instructing in a more lecture-like way, right? And that's been really great. It does things like teach students how to work together in teams, which is how most real-life jobs work. And it's also been really lovely to see sometimes students who are really shy and aren't maybe the first person who's going to stand up in a classroom and answer questions or something, say, oh no, I can do that. Or after several years, really taking a leadership role, right? So maybe they came in, they worked on this maybe as a volunteer in their first year, and then in their second or third year, they took it as a course, and then by their fourth year, they're instructing the other students in how to do it. And everything from, how do you actually fix a wall in a museum? How do you hang work? How do we make decisions about how to hang work? Those are all, there's a range of actual applied theory that come into practice, right? And so that's been really fun, and it's a really great experience for our students.
Well, and I can even imagine the vetting process of going through potential contributions to the exhibit, and then being on that end of it. How are these decisions made? Really understanding that allows you to do a whole bunch of things, including taking constructive feedback useful or well.
Right. Well, and that they might actually be in a position to have to give constructive feedback to their peers, because their friends are going to say, hey, why wasn't I included, right? And they have to develop the skills to answer that question in a way that is useful to the learner, right? And that's really a useful skill to have.
And they have to come up with a theme. And do they have a pedagogical focus when they do an exhibit? Like, is there something they wish to teach when they're showing an exhibit? Is there?
So in the ones that I show, it's usually that they're curating there's two that I usually run, and one is a student show of other students.
Okay.
So that doesn't, a pedagogical theme wouldn't work. And in that one, we do have to talk about, okay, do you want a really tight theme, in which case you're going to have to reject a lot of people? Do you want a really inclusive theme? I don't instruct them on that. I instruct them on what okay, like, did you think about this? If you what will happen, right? The other one that they typically do is a student curated show of the faculty's art.
Oh, right.
And that has been a really fantastic experience that I have to applaud my studio colleagues for, because it's actually a crazy idea to say, let's get undergrads to vet their professors' work, right? And it really took a lot of buy-in from my colleagues, and I'm so grateful to them for that. But when I suggested, okay, well, why don't we have the Art History Museum Studies majors curate the faculty show, they were all like, sure, great. And they even went so far as to say, okay, many of them open their studios, so they would, the student curators would go to the artist's studio and say, tell me about this work. Like, they would try and learn and then select which works they wanted, which puts them in a really weird power relationship with their professors, but it has been really great too. It requires a certain amount of role playing, let's say, on everyone's part, right? And a lot of trust by my colleagues in
trust and just growth in so many different ways, right? Even just in terms of your personality traits and characteristics.
Right.
So.
And that thing of modeling professional behavior, right? Like what does it mean for you to curate this show and to go out into this artist's studio? The artist has to believe in the curator to some extent, right? They have to trust that the curator's not going to do something that is disrespectful to the way that their work is hung. Right. So, the students are learning how to model that professionalism, right? So that the artists that they're curating have faith in them. And that, there's a whole bunch of learning things that happen there that's really great.
Right.
And better to do it there with your profs who might gently, subtly indicate some ways that you can improve on that, right?
Right. Well, and give you that feedback rather than in a professional situation where you just never get a job again.
Right. Yeah. So that's been in the museum studies aspect of the courses, we get to really work on those kinds of skills in a different way, which is fabulous.
Yeah, that's great. So just in case any of our viewers are interested in seeing some of these shows, the Penny Building is downtown in Lethbridge. It's on 5th Street, I think, correct?
Right.
And it's a University of Lethbridge building.
Right.
And there's gallery space. And when are the shows roughly, or how can people find out about them?
They're usually in this what we call the spring term at the university, which means the winter, and that there would be one in February and one in April. Okay. And if you followed the University of Lethbridge Faculty of Fine Arts Facebook page, they would show it.
They would say that. Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. It's really great experiential learning, right? That's sort of the buzzword about at this moment, that we want students to do this experiential learning because we want them to, it's great to be in a classroom, you learn all these skills and you practice them, but to actually now take them on the road, right? And to see how they apply in the workforce and really understand what that skill set is that they're learning at university and how that can be applied. It gives them an advantage and an edge when they get out on the job market because they understand their skill sets.
Right.
So.
And the museum studies side of the program is really quite marketable, which is useful. There's lots of work in Alberta, which we're really proud of. Because my research is more into the history and the theory, I'm always interested in questions of how that theory can get applied. And so one of the central concerns I have in my research is inclusivity and the question of what stories do museums tell? It's clear that they tend to be a pretty exclusive story that museums tell. So when the students are curating, even when they're curating the faculty or their students, to me there's a really important question of, okay, you picked a theme. Did that theme lead to submissions from a certain population or not from a certain population? And what does that mean? And what do you do about it? Okay? So there's a really clear applied theory there that is really important. So for example, it's never happened that we had a theme that only attracted female artists.
Right.
But given that our student population is fairly highly female, that might come up. It's the reverse in the regular museum world, right? Where there are themes that, it's like we just had a show of 20 artists and all of them are male. That comes up at the National Gallery, for example. Here we're likely to have the inverse, but the students can deal with the questions around it here in a lower stakes environment in some sense.
And you're just you just finished a book, I think, right, on this exact topic, which I think came out of a class even that you were teaching.
Right, yeah.
So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
Okay.
We often ask at universities, how does your research inform your teaching? But for me, one of the things that has been important here is to realize that actually my teaching informs my research in lots of ways, right? From students in classes often ask questions that are really surprising to me, and you think, actually that's not in the literature. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
That's important, right? And sort of following those things up can have led me to interesting places. Right. But the book that I'm just in the process of getting published right now comes out of a particular assignment in a course. So I was teaching a course on gender issues in art. And when we were doing so the course was structured by theme, but moving chronologically through time. So when we were dealing with basically sexism in the 19th century, students were quite open to that, right? Like, and that wasn't too challenging for them in terms of material. But as we got towards the present, it became more and more threatening, I would say, to their beliefs, right? And I found that, so this would have been maybe in 2011 or something like that, students were really quite sure that gender issues were no longer significant. And so I realized, I have to make an assignment that allows them to reconsider this question.
Right.
I mean, they don't have to have the same opinion as I have on that, but they have to think about it in the ways that we learned in those using the things we learned in the earlier sections, right?
Right, yeah.
So I went out, I said, okay, go out and do a count some kind of art institution and its gender record. And students came back and basically started by saying, well, the institution I looked at, the art gallery that I looked at, it must have been an anomaly because, it was really bad. It showed mostly men. And, as we sort of went through the class and each student reported on their gallery, it became clear to me that this was actually a research topic that needed to happen. And that led to all sorts of different learning outcomes because 2 students in the class came and said, we want to work on this. Like, do you want to work on this? And okay, so they ended up getting the Chinook Summer Research Awards, and we went and counted the gender and then later the ethnicity of artists at institutions across the country, which quantified what we really already know in the discipline in some senses, which is that museums, despite seeming like really progressive places, often still tell stories that are very white and very male, essentially.
So the Chinook Summer Research Awards are scholarships that the students can apply for, which allow them to work with a professor in the summer to work on a particular research topic.
Right.
And these students, I think, even co-authored a chapter with you.
Right. So the book, which I hope will come out in the next 6 months or so.
What's it called?
It is currently called Counting Diversity, Gender in Canadian Art Institutions.
Right. But that could be evolving.
Yeah, I might not have got that quite right. In any case, so the first chapter is co-authored by me and 4 students. So 2 sets of 2 students had Chinooks over the summer. And that Chinook research program here it's a real strength of the university, right? Because it allows students to be working in ways like a second or third or fourth year student to be working with you in a really intensive environment and to see what research in the field feels like, right? So while museum work is often group work, art history is often quite isolated work, right? So that sense of the students going, like I was alone in my office for 8 hours, right? Who knew that was what art historians do, but the same as yours, we are often quite solitary. So that experience, for some of them, it was like, this is what I want to do. For others, I think it was a bit more like, I didn't know research would be so hard, right? But to be able to allow students to experience that research and that they're getting a publication out of it, I think is really great.
Yeah, publication's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not something that undergraduate students often get an opportunity to be involved in a research project and get an authorship out of it as well.
Yeah, at a bigger institution that wouldn't happen. It would go to graduate students, right? And so here our undergraduate students, because we tend to form pretty close relationships and close mentorships with our undergrad students, they get to have that experience, right?
So did they get opportunities to present the material as well? Because we often present it at conferences or in public forums of different descriptions.
Right. Those students I didn't present with them, but other students I have. So I'm also quite interested in refugee work, which has come up into my teaching in various ways. And last year, a student who had just recently graduated and had done some work on a contemporary artist who works on refugees. I thought she will probably want to go to grad school, and I thought we could, because she wants to go to grad school, I think there was a sort of natural project there. Right. And we ended up co-presenting it last year at the annual conference, which happened to be in Banff this year, but can be anywhere in Canada, on the artist Ai Weiwei. Have you heard of Ai Weiwei? Yeah. Lots of people know him because he designed the Bird's Nest Stadium for the Olympics in China. Yeah. And he's a very famous Chinese dissident artist. He was in prison for a long time, and he makes work about refugees, and for several years he's been working on that. So we created a project to understand his refugee work in a way using 19th century art theory. And it was very well received and a great experience, I think, for both me and the student.
Right, yeah, and that fits into everything you've been talking about with diversity and inclusivity. Right. And that is something that you're well known for on campus as well, is your work with the Syrian refugees.
Right.
And it's a very powerful and empowering story, and I wonder if you might share that with us a little bit, how you got started, what motivated you initially, and sort of where that project took you, and how students were pulled into that experience as well.
When I started the refugee work, I didn't really think that it related to either art history or teaching, but of course it does, right? When your teaching is part of the way you experience the world or the way you understand the world, it gets integrated. Right? So was it in 2015, I believe? I think many of us across the world saw those pictures of Ellen Kurdi washed up on the shore, the young Syrian child who had died. And I was really struck by the university's role in this community and felt like we are a community. The university is a community, and we talk about ourselves as a community, and communities are sponsoring refugees. And I happened to be seated at an event beside Erin Phillips, who I didn't know at the time, but I had never met her before. And I sort of leaned over and said, would you be interested? Do you think we could figure out a way to have the university be one of those community sponsors for refugees? And she was very supportive, let's say, very enthusiastically supportive.
So Erin is our ecumenical campus minister.
Right, Erin is our ecumenical campus minister. Right. And I tend to be a little bit shy, as you may be able to tell on this interview, I don't know. But Erin was like, yeah, call Mike Mann. But I would never have done it without Erin. So Erin and I decided we were going to sort of strike a committee on campus, and we got in touch with the university president, Mike Mann, and said, there's a group of us who would like to see if we can sponsor a refugee. And I really thought, the university president, he's a very busy man. I didn't think that he would return my email, but he almost immediately said, can you come down to my office this afternoon? Let's figure out how to do this, right? So without his support, it wouldn't have happened. And so the university came together, and it's a longer sort of circumnavigated story, but we ended up partnering with a bunch of other groups, so basically 4 groups, 2 Anglican churches and a group of doctors and some other random community groups who've ended up sponsoring 4 families. We've got another family coming in our 5th family will come shortly, and there's one more family that we're committed to because they're a series of related families. But while I was doing that was at that time, it wasn't clear what the Canadian government would do to support those refugees. And there was people were very upset on campus and elsewhere about it. I had an art history museum studies major come to me and say, essentially, that she was from a small community who didn't really support the idea of refugees, and she didn't know how to talk to them about it, and she didn't know, she wanted to help but wondered what she could do about it. And so our first group, we had really thought of the sponsorship as something faculty and staff would do, which is essentially how it played out. But as that, when that student came to me, fortuitously, the same day I'd gotten an email from someone saying, well, why are you doing it this way? Like, most universities sponsor refugees as students. And I hadn't really heard of that, but when the student came to me, I said, well, there's this thing, and it's called the World University Service of Canada, and it's a national organization that's been around for 60 or 70 years that does many development programs, but its sort of flagship development program is a refugee sponsorship group. Student clubs across Canada form at universities, and they typically get every student to pay $2 a year $2 a term we're paying here now, and use that money to bring in a qualified refugee student to campus. And when they come, then they get landed immigrant status, so they can stay once they're finished their schooling. So, within 3 months, the students started a club, raised the money to sponsor a student with lots of help from the International Center and the administration, and lots of student donations as well, and now have made it a regularized program. So our first refugee student came 2 years ago, and then we had a year off, and we'll have another refugee student come this summer. And that actually relates to the project, my Board of Governors Teaching Chair project, because working with that student group, the WUSC student group, has been really important to my realizations of what kinds of learning can be really meaningful for students. And that club it's an incredibly lovely group of students, and really committed students who come from all different areas of the university, all different majors, to do something that's good both internationally and locally, right? So, so that's been fabulous for me.
Yeah, they led a student referendum, right? And which convinced the student body voted to do that $2 a semester donation, so that every student is contributing to the refugee problem.
Right?
So,
so that's...
crisis, I should call it.
Right? So that they did the outreach work to get other students committed to it. And, the feedback we've had from students is great. Like, I haven't heard any students complaining about it. In fact, mostly what students say is $2 a term, why aren't we paying more, right? So that doesn't happen without the students doing education work, right? So for me, looking at this group of students who are educating each other and who are learning from various faculty on campus and staff, and from the first refugee who's arrived already, who they now know and who's changed their knowledge of the world, right? That recognition of how important the informal learning can be on campus, and how, university, it's a really transformative time, or it can be a really transformative time in people's lives, and the courses are one part of that and an important part, but the other kinds of learning that happen outside the courses and often through student clubs are really important. So when I was thinking about a project for the teaching chair, it seemed to me that student clubs are a really important resource on campus, and because they're run through the student union, we faculty can be sometimes kind of distant from those clubs, but I really want to look at how we can empower students to take that informal learning and relate it to their more formal learning in a variety of ways. And I'm not quite sure how that will play out yet, but and I'll start with asking the students, right, with surveying the students of in what ways do they think the student clubs are working for their informal learning, and in what ways do they think we could support them more in that? Because I know across campus that most of us really want to support student clubs. I know the history department has a very active student club, right? The Thugs, I believe they're called.
We're the Thugs, the History Undergraduate Society.
Right? And our art society also has lots of activities, right? But all of that across disciplines, there's some sort of structural questions about how can we help you more to relate those things to disciplinary knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. It relates to disciplinary knowledge, and then it also hits that fourth pillar of liberal education, right? That is a key pillar for our institution in terms of sort of our foundational educational principles, which is civic engagement.
Right.
And we really want students to take their educational experience and bring it out to improve the world. So it's great that you want to get a job, right? We want you to get a job. We want you to do those things. But an education also prepares you to do so many other things that can improve the world around you. And if you just want to be engaged, and your work with WISC is just such a great example of what that can be. And then the skills that come with it in the informal learning are just reinforced. And
to me it's been a fabulous experience for all of those students. So even if we go back to questions of museum studies, like those students might not have, when I talk about how museums can be exclusionary, that might not mean anything until you are identified with one of the groups that it is excluded, right? Yeah. So you might think, well, yeah, but that's because European art is best. Why do we need to include anyone else, right? And then once you get a sort of more connection to a more diverse understanding of the population that we are in this city, for example, you might it might feel more real to you. And so that's been a really lovely thing to see, like students taking that knowledge back into the classroom and saying, oh yeah, what about these issues?
Yeah. So, yeah. Talking about these different international experiences, I just came from China, teaching conference in China, and they were very interested in bringing the ISW to China. And you mentioned the ISW a little bit early in our conversation. Yeah. So the ISW is the Instructional Skills Workshop, and I know that you really, really loved that experience, and that it's part of that teaching journey that was really critical to you. Yeah. So your ISW experience, where did that sort of fit into all of this teaching journey?
It was a really transformational experience for me. You know, I had a few courses that I was unhappy with. I didn't feel like they were working that well, but I didn't quite know what to do to get them better. And I was coming off a study leave and felt like one of the things that has become clearer and clearer to me over time is how important teaching is. Like, our research can be speaking to a very select audience, right? So I wanted to prioritize teaching in my work. You know, it's always half of our work, but I wanted to give it a higher priority maybe than it had. And the Teaching Center offers these instructional skills workshops in the summer. And the program comes out of British Columbia, and it's probably 20 years or something old. And what became really important to me is that it starts with a kind of model for good teaching, and it stresses interactive learning, right? It's sort of moving away from the idea of a lecture-based learning. But what became really important to me in the experience is the way it's structured. You're with a group of your peers, and you each have to give these mini lessons. And I was sort of focused on, it'll be me, giving a lesson. But for me, what was most important was me sitting on the other side of the table, receiving someone else's lesson. Yeah. Because in the way the model works, you give a lot of feedback to each of the instructors about what worked well and what didn't work well for you as a learner. And to be at a stage where I was thinking more reflectively about how I wanted to teach, and then to be put in the position of a learner and realize, there's models that I didn't think would work for me as a learner, because I'm a very bookish person. I didn't really like active learning, to be honest. I thought I didn't like it. Then I realized, actually I did like that. Some things I didn't like, some things I did. But to be put in the position of a learner again was really useful. And it came at a moment that was just perfect for me. I just think it's one of the really great things that the Teaching Center does, but it does lots of fabulous things. And I think it's great that the university is so committed to helping faculty be better instructors, right? If you want to learn to improve your teaching, these opportunities are here for you, right? So I liked it so much. The following year I decided you're not allowed to take it twice, I guess, I don't know. But they offer facilitators to become a facilitator of those instructional skills workshop. And I really didn't want to be a facilitator. But I did want to take it again to think about it more. So I took the facilitators workshop course, and now I've facilitated, 2 or 3, I think, workshops so then you have 4 or 5 either graduate students or other professors who also want to work on their teaching. And every time I do it, I learn new things. It's been a really great experience for me. Right.
And you talked about how it's part of a reflective teaching practice. And more and more, I'm convinced that that's central, right? To being an effective instructor is to be reflective about your teaching practice.
Well, because being reflective implies that you'd be willing to change it, right? To recognize, that thing that I'm committed to is actually not doing what I want it to do. So now that I've had that recognition, I am sort of forced to act, right? So to me, that's been a really useful, like that once you start to step back from it, you can, and be more reflective about it, that leads you to action, right? To change things that aren't working. But the thing that that I've been through quite a few ISWs, the sense that it might be a kind of prescriptive model and it would tell you to teach this way, that's not what it is, right? And every group comes in with different concerns. The way the model works, it really allows you as an instructor to decide what it is that you want to focus on and work on, right? And sometimes you'll get feedback from the students that what you think is the problem isn't actually the problem, right? And that has been useful too, to watch instructors go, oh, I was worried about this, and it's not an issue, but I can improve over here, right? So that's been really helpful to me to get that kind of feedback. It's led me to do things in my classroom really differently in terms of feedback. Now I always have all sorts of informal feedback throughout the term, like sometime around week 3, I put out a questionnaire to the students saying, what's working for you and what are you finding challenging so far in the course? And for me, that's been a really transformational experience for lots of different reasons. I mean, there's certain things that come up every year, like I talk too fast. That continues to be a challenge for me, right? And I do try, but to think of, okay, so I talk too fast. That is a natural thing for me. What am I going to do to mitigate that, right? Handing out notes which I didn't used to do, or telling the students, I talk too fast. But you'll notice I repeat things. So now, when I repeat this to you and I tell you I'm repeating this, do you know what that means? It means it's important, right? Like now, it's enabled me to be more, to address the stresses that they're experiencing, right? But it also changes their sense of empowerment in the classroom, like to the sense that I think all the instructors at the university actually care about the teaching. But the students don't always know that we care about their learning, right? So when you give out the feedback form early, and they sense, oh, this prof actually cares, right? That's different than that when they don't know that you care, even if you do care.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and I found too that students are so much more receptive when you explain what your objectives are in something, right? So this is my objective in this assignment, which might seem boring or quirky or whatever it is that I'm giving you, but these are the objectives that I want. This is why I'm doing it in this particular way. And then they get to see your passion and your excitement, and and then you're all in it together, right?
Right, and that sense that you're there to support their learning rather than to assess their learning only. I mean, you do have to in the end assess them, right? But that up until the assessment you're supporting I think that's it. It changes the way the classroom feels for them and for you, right? So sometimes in the olden days when I was lecturing and it was a big class, you'd sort of walk in and feel like, it's not a good vibe in here, right? But now, more often than not, the vibe is good, right? Because they sense that I care about them, and that makes them more invested in the learning as well, right? So, and all of that really came out of the ISW, that sense for me that, and I think everyone who did an ISW, an instructional skills workshop, they might have different takeaways, but for me, the outcomes-based learning was important. Right. And the other sense that was really important to me was that the students had to feel like I was on their team, and that I cared about them in a way that I knew I did, but they didn't always know that I did.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and that's so the ISW is sort of your gateway drug to the teaching center.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
And what other ways have you been?
The teaching center addict. I'm a fan. So the teaching center also helped me with another project that related to my goals. I know that for some students, memorizing dates, which is a part of art history, is really important. Listening to my kids who were younger at the time, who could so I have students who sometimes say, well, I can't remember, if ancient Greece comes before or after the Renaissance. And you think, no, you need to know that. That's actually like a baseline. I need you to know that.
And there's 1,000 years.
Yeah, and there's 1,000 years. Let's just, but you can remember a millennia. But then my kids were talking at that time, they were interested in Pokemon, and they were sort of saying, well, he was a 750, but then he morphed into a 920, right? And they knew the history, but they could attach numbers to it, right? So I was like, okay, there's something about gaming that we have to use in academia, right? I applied for the Teaching Development Fund to develop a video game, and that led me down an interesting teaching route, which likewise had lots of students mobilized, so not art history students typically, but students in new media and in computing science that I ended up working with a team of over a couple of years, and we got a grant to further develop it. And we eventually developed a module of a video game. You can play it at thecuratorgame.com that tells a story of a curator in a museum that gets transported back to ancient Greece. Ancient Greece seemed to be a real struggling point for my students, so we set it there. That then tries to sort of gamify certain of the required memorization strategies. It's funny to see how that works in the art history classroom, and for some students it does work. Many of the art history students are kind of like, oh, I don't ever play games. So in that sense, I'm not sure that it worked for the audience that I thought it would work for. In terms of creating interdisciplinary networks, it was really great. Like the computing science students in particular really valued that work experience. So they worked with my colleague Howard Chang, and went on to have that be an important part of their CV, right? So again, like undergraduate students getting work experience in summer projects was really important. And again, with a video game, I'm not sure for most of the students it really helped them memorize in the way that I hoped that it would. But what it definitely does is help them recognize that I'm open to them learning in different ways. Right. So there's definitely some use there.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe the game's not. I didn't put a lot of killing in the game, and that seems to be what a lot of video game people like. I don't know.
Lesson learned.
Yeah, right.
Next time you create a video game on
more swords, less art.
Okay.
You win some, you lose some.
Well, and you have many projects through the Teaching Center, and so now you'll embark on the new Board of Governors Teaching Chair, and I wish you all the luck in your refugee and student club.
Oh, thank you.
Endeavors as you go through for the next 2 years, and I really look forward to working with you for the next
That is
year.
one of the best parts, is I get to work with you, and I know you also share all those values of civic engagement and informal learning and mobilizing. So yeah, that's a real thrill for me.
Yeah, I know it's great. We'll fit together well in the next year. So
absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming today and for speaking with us. It was a very interesting conversations, and it was great to let some people out there know who you are and what your values are and what your teaching philosophies are. It was great. Thanks so much, Anne.
Thank you.
Okay.